My precious saints, it is the 3rd of the 3rd, 2022. And I just want to pray first. Lord, I really pray that you would give me the ability to communicate very clearly what I'm seeing with the eyes of my heart and hearing with the ears of my heart, that you would help me to put it into simple language so that the remnant can understand the light and the truth that I'm sharing. I pray for those that struggle with these concepts, Father, that you would bring further confirmation as to what you would have them do individually in this season, because you have a plan for each one of us. In Jesus' name. So, precious remnant, today we are going to learn to think like farmers as we discuss keeping in step with the Spirit and following the cloud. There's some very important keys the Holy Spirit is giving me about Passover this year. Last Passover in Douglas, South Africa, I gave a message about being ready to move and that everything was going to change, and that how we must understand that we carry Him, who is the fulfillment of every feast inside of us. The Lord said at that time that He was loosing me from the Aaronic priesthood and moving me into the Melchizedek priesthood. And shortly after this, the Spirit said to me that I must move from the Hebrew calendar that is followed by the rabbis to the calendar which observes the sighting of the new moon to determine the start of a new month, and which also relies on the ripeness of the barley in Israel as a second indicator of the start of a new year. I always consult the Hebrew calendar when looking at the dates of the feasts, because the feasts have very important prophetic revelations. Every year, God gives a deeper and a wider revelation through these feasts, and so I'm always checking when they are going to occur. But last year, He shifted me to a different calendar. It was quite a significant shift, as there was no longer a neatly worked out pattern for 10 years ahead to be able to consult, but rather it was a more flexible timetable depending on the signs in the sky and the crop on the ground. I didn't announce it to my subscribers at the time because I wanted to see where God was taking me with this, and I didn't want to cause confusion or get into some kind of argument with people about when the right time was to celebrate the feasts. This was something God was doing with me personally, and I wanted to understand why He was doing it. Finally, after writing a number of articles on separation and precise positioning and the like, I am just now seeing the vast significance of God's reasoning and purpose in this move and shift. And it concerns the transition from an old season of preparation in the Lord to a new season of passing over in His precise timing. The next feast that we must take note of this year is Passover. Such a significant prophetic marker as we are all pondering our movement out of the world system and the emerging New World Order. With the events in Ukraine, anyone with eyes in their head can see that there's an aggressive push to speed up the timetable of the rollout of their blueprint so that the Antichrist can step onto the stage and bring a false peace out of chaos. Now, there's much I could say about this, but that is for another post. Let's focus on Passover and precise timing and synchronization with the movement of the Spirit as He leads the remnant out. Remember also that the Lord said to me recently that I am ministering to the tip of the spear, the Judah camp, who move out first. Now, I'm going to talk about the Hebrew calendar and the barley harvest, and how in this particular year, understanding the prophetic message unfolding before our eyes has never been more important, to be in step with the Spirit. Please don't let your eyes glaze over if you do not follow the Hebrew calendar. Listen to what the Spirit is saying through these things. Now, Wednesday, March the 2nd, 2022, yesterday, begins the month of Adar Bet, which is the 13th month for those on the Hillel calendar, the Hebrew calendar that is usually followed. This is an automatic leap year. Hillel created the calculated calendar because the Jews were being driven out of the land of of Israel through persecution, and they needed something so that all the Jews around the world would be able to keep the holy days at the proper time, even though they had no one in the land of Israel to observe the barley and the crescent moon. Now God said to begin the year in the first month called Aviv, and we read that in Exodus 12, verse 2. This month shall be to you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And he gave this first month the name of the barley stage of ripeness, in which the kernels are able to pass through fire without being vaporized. Why can they do this? Because when the extreme surrounding heat only hardens the outer covering of the grain kernels, then there is sufficient protein in the grains to be able to be ground to produce the first fruits barley wave offering. God never said in his word to calculate his timing for years in advance. He said to watch for when the barley is aviv, because when the grains are aviv, 2 weeks later, they will be able to be reaped for the Passover first fruits offering. And that is how you would know that the new moon was the new moon for the month which held Passover. Aviv in Hebrew means barley ripening, or by extension, spring season. In Hebrew, it's also used as a given name and a place name, such as Tel Aviv. The first month of the year is called the month of Aviv during the first 5 books of the Bible, and it's also called Nisan in the book of Esther. These names are sometimes used interchangeably, although Aviv actually refers to a 3-month season, and Nisan is called the first month of Aviv. The basic meaning of the word Aviv is the stage in the growth of grain when the seeds have reached full size and are filled with starch, but have not dried yet. There is still moisture in them. So the month of Aviv is not the month that the barley must be ripe, as some people today assume. It's the month when the barley is ripening, which is why it's also known as the month of green ears. So, how is the barley in Israel doing at the moment? The latest report 2 weeks ago from Israel was that the barley was just heading or flowering, and some of it was in the early dough stage. Now, I'm going to, in the written article, put a picture that shows the different stages of barley growth. So if you're listening to the podcast of this, please also, if you're not a subscriber, email me at freshoil@polka.co.za so that I can send you a copy of the written version and you can see the pictures. Remember, you must have barley you can roast to remove the rest of the moisture from it in order to make flour by wave sheaf day, and not by the 1st of Aviv. Passover is always celebrated 2 weeks after the new moon, and therefore Passover is celebrated on a full moon. But all of this that we're talking about depends on whether the Lord of the harvest sends the warming weather for the barley to develop or cold weather to stunt the growth. It is God who controls when man will be able to offer a first fruits barley sheaf. So barley was in the flowering and early milk stage by February the 18th, 2022. In other words, by this week, the first week of March, it may be ready to be earmarked as Aviv barley. And they usually tie it into a bunch while it is still growing in the field. And then they harvest it for the first fruits offering 2 weeks later. Now, the new moon occurs in this week. It will either be sighted tonight, March the 3rd, from Jerusalem, or more likely March the 4th, because it's such a thin sliver that is visible on this night of March the 3rd that the naked eye may not be able to see it. So it may only be sighted on Friday the 4th at the beginning of the Sabbath. So what on earth am I trying to point out by all this information I'm giving you? Well, the preset Hillel calendar that a large percentage of the remnant consult for feast dates has added in an extra month in this year, 5782, so that they celebrate Passover in April. However, God anchored the start of every new year in his calendar on two significant signs, the new moon and the Aviv barley. This year, it is very clear that the God who controls the weather has ripened the barley in time for Passover to be celebrated a month earlier than the preset calendar. Now let's look at what God told his people when they entered the promised land. Leviticus 23:10. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you have come into the land which I give to you, and shall reap the harvest of it, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. The word for sheaf is the Strong's word H6016, which means sheaf or omer, O-M-E-R, which is a dry measure. The people of God were instructed to present an omer of first fruits barley to the Lord, obviously in ground form as flour. In English, the word sheaf refers more to a bundle of cut stalks of grain. That's what I always think of when I hear the word sheaf. But a more accurate translation of that verse 11 might be, he shall wave the dry measure of grains of the first fruits of the harvest to the priest. What was actually done in the temple was the waving of about 2 quarts or liters of new crop barley flour. After the flour was waved, the people were permitted to eat of the new crop. And there is evidence that the grain was actually cut after sunset the night before, then thrashed to separate the grain from the chaff, parched in the fire, and ground into fine flour so it would be ready to be waved early the next morning. There is no place recorded in historical documents or biblical accounts where you can find the barley being cut and stored and then offered after sitting on the shelf or in a barn for 3 to 4 weeks. Nowhere. Would anyone think to offer God old barley? No, he demands the very first of the first fruits. Now there's another important point for keeping in step with the Spirit. When they were told to count the Omer to the next feast, Shavuot or Pentecost, the Lord said this in Leviticus 23:15, and you shall count to you from the day after the Sabbath, from the day you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. 7 weeks after Passover, they would celebrate Shavuot or Pentecost, the day when God presented a marriage covenant to his people at Mount Sinai. Now, a sign in the sky is to give you information. When you go on a journey and you come to a signboard, you don't exclaim, there's a sign, there's a sign. What is actually important is what the sign says. So for those watching and waiting for the Lord and the bridegroom's return, noting the signs both in the heavens and in the earthly realm, and trying to synchronize with what God is doing, getting the passing over date wrong would mean one would miss the wedding 7 weeks later, because the 7-week journey to the face-to-face moment is measured by when one celebrates Passover. That means one misses one's appointed face-to-face moment with the bridegroom. Now, any bride who's preparing herself for her wedding would know that she has to know the date of the wedding, otherwise, she's not going to be ready for it. And so, in this year, it's very significant that the barley is ripe a whole month before the preset Hebrew calendar says it's time to celebrate Passover. So, for those who are in step with the Spirit, it seems that God is saying, pack up and cross over earlier than the rest of the remnant is preparing and anticipating to do that movement. Very significantly, the tip of the spear crosses over a threshold before the rest of the spear. They are hearing a frequency and passing through a spiritual atmosphere that the rest of the spearhead has not experienced yet. They are pulling up their tent pegs when those camping on the western side of the tabernacle in the wilderness are still drinking their morning coffee. God's strong right arm sends his tip of the spear company ahead of the pack. Judah follows the cloud when it moves. Immediately they see the cloud move, they pull up their tent pegs and get going. They do not say, "Oh, but I thought moving day was marked on the calendar for a month's time." Their indication for moving location was dependent upon God, not on calendar dates fixed by man. If the barley is already shattering, that's the term they use, meaning the ripe grains are falling to the ground on wave sheaf day, then you have to admit that you are most likely a month too late for a first fruits offering, because the first fruits barley offering is offered while the rest of the harvest is not in the right ripe stage for harvest. Now, because different regions of the country of Israel have different climates, the barley will ripen at different times, and Jerusalem is one of the cooler regions of the country, and so it is one of the last regions in which the barley ripens. Even when the children of Israel crossed into what is now known as the land of Israel, they ate of the produce of the fields in Gilgal on the morrow after the Passover. And you can read that in Joshua 5, verse 10 to 12. The barley in Gilgal ripens about a month before there would be harvestable barley in Jerusalem. This is incredibly significant spiritually because Gilgal is the place at which the men who crossed over ready for war on the 10th of Aviv were circumcised. In other words, they entered into covenant with God, and circumcision was a sign of this. And God required them to be in covenant with Him before they were allowed to celebrate their first Passover in the Promised Land. So, in the same way as the crops of barley in Israel ripen at different times, amongst the remnant barley company that are expecting to be taking over the Father's business in the next season, there are some that are more ready in their hearts than others. And these who are ready are part of the barley first fruits offering, those who are harvested first. They are a smaller number, the tip of the spear, who transition ahead of the rest of the pack of barley sons. Remember, the word bar is Aramaic for a son who is ready to take over his father's business and to be set in place. This tip of the spear have soaked in the light of the sun, they've consumed all the rain that he sent upon their hearts, and they carry enough spiritual protein to be able to pass through fiery heat and emerge as fine flour, a wave offering to the Lord. Interestingly, the barley plants in the field that are shorter are usually ripe first because their energy has been put into maturing their seed rather than in growing tall. Now, there's a message in that. And yes, the rest of the barley that is slightly behind in their ripening will also be harvested during the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. In fact, when Ruth, dressed in her finest outfit, perfumed herself and lay at Boaz's feet, Naomi told her she would find her future husband threshing barley at the threshing floor, even though it was then time for the first fruits of the wheat harvest to be presented to the Lord. So, what does this mean spiritually? Well, some barley sons are growing side by side in the field, and to the casual observer, they look to be at the same stage of ripeness. But it is the fire test that determines which are aviv and which still have some growing to do and maturing. Excuse me. What does the word say? Two will be in a field, one will be taken and one will be left. They are side by side, but God inspects them and chooses one and not the other. They might be growing right next to each other. The state of maturity of the grain is different. The Greek word for translated taken in those verses means to be brought near. So, what is the factor for choosing who are brought near in the season that we're going into? Well, the process of choosing and separating the barley first fruits offering while it's still growing in the field helps us to understand. Those who are marked as part of the first fruit sheaf are harvested and removed from the growing place ahead of the rest of the barley harvest. They go from standing and growing to being on the move, experiencing a baptism of fire, and being processed into a form where they can be waved as a first fruits offering. Overnight, this change happens. And it's during the night that the baptism of fire and the grinding into flour happens. And by the morning, the wave offering is offered. Yet the marking for those who were part of the first fruits sheaf happened 2 weeks before in the field, when it was the time of the new moon. Any farmer anywhere in the world knows it's impossible to set a precise day of harvest by the calendar. It is done by the state of ripeness of the harvest. Every year you have to be patient and wait until you notice that the grain or the fruit has reached its optimum point of ripening. But the harvesting, moving, and offering of the first fruit sheaf indicates that the rest of the barley will be ready within the following weeks to be harvested by the sickle and put to whatever use heaven has declared it should be. James 5 verse 7 says, "So be patient, brethren, as you wait until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits expectantly for the precious harvest of the land, how he keeps up his patient vigil over it until it receives the early and the late rains." And Mark 4 verse 28 says, "The earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, and then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe and permits, immediately he sends forth the reapers and puts in the sickle, because the harvest stands ready." Now, I don't know if you remember, those of you who've been subscribers for a few months, I wrote an article about pepper dews. And I spoke about my friend who had a dream of God's hand holding 2 pepper dews on the same stalk. Well, here's an interesting update, which is actually a sign in the earth that confirms this message that I'm sharing with you. That friend that had the dream discovered 2 such pepper dews growing in her mother's garden where she lives. And they were green. She sent me a picture of the 2 green pepper dews growing on the bush. And then she sent me, about a week ago, another photograph. And one of the pepper dews had turned red overnight. Now, the day before, from the outward appearance, they both looked to be in the same state of ripeness to the human eye. They were both green. But overnight, during the darkness of the night, the one pepper indicated outwardly that it was ripe and ready for harvest. In other words, those 2 pepper dews, The pepper dew flowers were not fertilized on the same day. The one was slightly ahead of the other. The one was part of the tip of the spear, and the other would follow on behind. So I wanted to share this with you because there are some of you who are in contact with me, and others I don't have any knowledge of what's happening in your lives. But God seems to be moving you ahead of the rest of the remnant in his plans and in the unrolling of his scroll and blueprint for you. And you are to keep in step with the Spirit, because you are passing over into a new season, and he is setting you in place as a son ready to take over his father's business in the appointed place where he's planting you. Just as for those who watch for the new moon and for the ripeness of the barley, will be celebrating Passover a full month before those who follow the preset Hebrew calendar, who celebrate it in April, will be doing. Now, if we look at what's happening in the earth, in Eastern Europe, and the very fast speed at which the dominoes seem to be falling one after the other, to my spirit, it makes sense that for God's remnant, the cloud is moving and that Judah needs to move out so that the rest of the spearhead and the rest of the shaft of the spear can follow on behind. If we were to wait another whole month before thinking that we're going into a new season and the first month of God's calendar year, we may find ourselves with barley grains that are so ripe that they've fallen to the ground and died. I don't know if you can hear what I'm saying, remnant saints. I know for those of you who've followed the preset calendar for many years, this is a difficult message because it requires untying yourself from that calendar. But the significance of it is the difference between being part of the first fruits offering to the Lord, the barley remnant that can take over their father's business, and being part of the barley that falls to the ground and dies. We have to keep in step with the Spirit. The cloud is moving. God has indicated that though there may be two in a field, one is going to be taken near, one is going to be brought near, sheltered, planted in Goshen, the place of drawing near, and kept safe during the months of tribulation that are ahead. And others are going to be left in the field. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the remnant. Selah.